Good morning, everyone, and I'm Colonel Shubhajit Naha, and I'm the co-founder of Protecte Academy. And today I am going to, explore a concept of confidentiality and explore it with an example. Right now, everybody talks about confidentiality, integrity, and availability. Now, today I'm going to talk about the concept of confidentiality. Now, confidentiality principally means that objects cannot be disclosed to unauthorized subjects, right? So if you have a data asset or you have an information asset or any other asset, it cannot be disclosed to someone who do not or does not have the right permissions to access it. That means you have to create a wall between the data asset and the subject who's trying to access it. Now, CISSP or any other certification, whether CISSP or CCSP or CISA or CISM, will test you on the concept of confidentiality for sure. So let's now understand that particular concept using the website, how data exchange takes place on uh, a web application, and what can be the confidentiality attacks on the on a web application. Right. So we saw that confidentiality means, the objects are not disclosed to unauthorized subject. So let's, understand what does the concept of confidentiality mean with the help of a diagram. Right. So let's see that, you have an object, right? And a subject is trying to, you know, access it. Now, the subject can be a human being, a subject can be a machine, generally subject is the active entity, right? And object is something which is, passive in nature, which is always acted upon by an active agent, right? So now the principle of confidentiality says that this subject should be able to access this object only if it is authorized. If it is authorized, then only it should be granted access. That means there is someone who needs to, deduce that whether the subject is authorized or not. Now, that is done by identity provision. You provide authenticity, and then the access control authorizes your access. Right? And this is the basic principle of confidentiality. And if the subject is unauthorized, if the subject is unauthorized, okay, you should not be allowed to grant access. Now, there can be a case where this unauthorized subject can bypass access control. If something like this happens, then the principle of confidentiality gets violated. Okay, so now let's see the same concept, by applying it on a basic web application, which runs on three major components, right? So in any web application, if you see that whenever you open a web application, the first thing that opens is a web browser. You need a web browser to communicate with the web server. This is the web application server. Now, inside the web application server, there are generally, three components. First is the web server. The task of the web server is to serve the content to the browser, okay, and receive the requests from the person or from the browser, receive the request and give the request. Now, generally, this is carried out with HTML and CSS files. Okay, those HTML and CSS files are open on your browser as something which is visible to you, right? So that means there is a subject here who is trying to access a web application, right? And the object becomes your web server. Right? That means there is a layer of access control which is involved here, right? So generally you would have seen such access controls are given by username and password. If you have the username and password, you are able to access the web application, right? Otherwise, you are only able to surf it. You cannot go inside the functionalities which is provided by a web server, right? If you want to access your internet banking, unless you give the username, password, and a multi-factor authentication, you cannot access this. Now, what is this control? This is the control which is allowing or disallowing a subject from accessing the innermost part of that web application. Now, once you authenticate with your username and password, then only you are able to get into the deeper layers of your web application. That is, now you are able to access the complete functionalities of your application software. Now, if you look at that, in this particular scenario, the web application now becomes a subject. Web server becomes the subject, and your application server becomes the object. That means there has to be a layer between the web server and the application server. Now, such interactions are internally managed by multiple mechanisms. There will be API authentication. If the web application is speaking to the application server using APIs, then there will be API authentication. Or there could be simple credentials, wherein the application server has certain credentials to access the application. The web server has certain credentials to access the application server. Or there could be some token-based access, wherein a web server has an authentication token with which it accesses the application server. Similarly, when data has to be pulled out from the database, then the application server becomes the subject and the database becomes the object. That means there will be a layer of authentication or access control between the application server and the database server. So now a subject object problem will always be there. So that means now principle of confidentiality can get compromised at multiple layers. Say if a user is trying to access his internet banking, and suppose this is an internet banking application, right? An authorized user, I'm denoting it by blue, can access this through a web application, goes to the through the internet service provider, accesses his web browser, and then he is able to authenticate, authorize, and able to access his data. At the same time, a bad entity or an unauthorized subject can, disclose or can violate the principle of confidentiality by many means. The first mean could be this bad actor, an unauthorized user, is able to guess your username and password, right? He's able to guess it. How does it guess? Okay. This particular actor surfs the internet and comes to know that you are, someone who is, your name is there, your date of birth is there, okay, and he tries certain username combinations and password combination, and he brute forces your username and password. But then he may not have the MFA, and for MFA, he might put a gun on your head and try to know the MFA, or he clones your device and is able to get the MFA. So you can see that the first level of confidential attack can happen here. Okay, there could be an internal threat at the bank level. Some bank employee who's disgruntled, has admin level access, goes and accesses the information at the back end, right? Confidentiality principle is broken. It might so happen that an unauthorized hacker is able to do a man in the middle attack and is able to, listen between you and your banking application and is able to do replay attack and violate the principle of confidentiality. Now, always remember, the principle of confidentiality, you will always have a subject and an object, whether the subject is authorized to access an object. And that's what I showed you using this particular web application, which is very, very common and everyone uses it. So, I thought that would be a better way of making people understand that how principle of confidentiality works. Take care. Thank you. Bye bye. If you like this video, please follow us. And you know, I'm Colonel Shubhajit Naha. Again, my mission is to make information and cybersecurity reach as many households, as many professionals as possible. Take care. Bye bye, and Jai Hind.